The Galactic Council had once been the epitome of unity and order across the stars. Its influence stretched across countless systems, binding the galaxy together with the weight of its authority. But in recent years, cracks had begun to form as rival factions pushed for greater autonomy, and tensions simmered in the Outer Rim territories. While the Council debated matters of trade and diplomacy, strange reports filtered in from the distant edges of the galaxy, whispers of anomalies in the fabric of reality itself. Colonies that had once been peaceful now saw strange phenomena emerging from the void ships, vanishing without a trace, whole settlements disappearing in the night only to return weeks later with no memory of what had transpired. Meanwhile, the once reliable warships of the Council sat idle in their docks, obsolete relics of a time when the galaxy had known peace and stability. The Council's military strength had slowly dwindled, and its inability to confront the growing unrest left its leaders uneasy, but nothing prepared them for the message that came through the comms that morning, a transmission so old that its signal barely reached the Council's central hub, a distress call sent from a vessel that was supposed to be lost to time itself. The message was faint at first, but it carried a single, undeniable identifier. The Leviathan, the name of the Council's most formidable warship, vanished from the records nearly 20 years ago after a disastrous mission on the edge of the Altrian system. The warship's crew was presumed dead, and the ship itself destroyed by the blast from a collapsing star. But there it was, a signal from the Leviathan, as if it had never left the galaxy's borders. Its faint echo was a cry for help lost for years, and yet it had resurfaced at the very moment the Council needed answers most. The transmission was fragmented, but the urgency in its tone was clear. The message spoke of coordinates unknown to anyone within the Council, and hinted at something out there that none of the Council's leaders were prepared to understand. The ship's return posed an immediate dilemma. The Outer Rim was already in turmoil, and the last thing the Council needed was a warship of the Leviathan's caliber falling into the hands of the wrong faction. The board of directors and the Council's military advisors met in emergency session, but their internal bickering grew louder by the minute. Should they investigate the source of the signal or ignore it entirely and risk injuring those who had sent it? Was this some kind of trap from a rival empire, or a desperate plea from survivors clinging to life aboard a derelict ship? Whatever the case, the Council could not afford to ignore it. The decision was made quickly. A small fleet would be assembled to trace the signal and investigate the Leviathan's return. It would be led by Admiral Malphar, who had commanded some of the Council's most successful campaigns in the past. But the Admiral was known for his cautious approach, and many questioned whether he had the resolve to deal with whatever lay ahead. Still, the order was given, and the fleet prepared to depart for the coordinates that would bring them face to face with a warship thought lost forever, and the mysteries it had kept hidden for so long. The fleet departed under the cover of darkness, its ships gliding silently through the cold expanse of space toward the coordinates transmitted by the distress signal. Admiral Malphar stood on the bridge of the flagship dreadnought, his eyes fixed on the holographic map that flickered before him. The journey was long and uneventful, the silence on the comms only broken by the occasional technical report from the fleet's engineers. The Admiral felt a growing unease gnaw at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the mission ahead. They were heading into unknown territory, a place where even the most advanced scans had failed to locate the Leviathan until now. As the fleet approached the designated location, something strange happened. The sensors began to pick up unusual readings, vast, unexplained gravitational anomalies that warped the fabric of space-time itself. It was as though the very air around them was bending, folding inward. Malphar's eyes narrowed as he stared at the readouts. The ship's AI confirmed the readings, but even it seemed baffled by the data. Whatever had caused the Leviathan to disappear, it was clear now that this place was no ordinary stretch of space. Suddenly, the fleet dropped out of warp, and there it was, looming before them, the ship that had been lost to the galaxy for decades. The Leviathan hung motionless in the darkness of space, its massive hull gleaming under the distant starlight, untouched by the ravages of time. The ship seemed almost too perfect, like a ghost from another era. The Council had believed it destroyed in the explosion that had claimed its crew and its mission so long ago, but there it was, defying all logic and expectations. The Admiral's voice broke the silence, a command issued with authority. "Prepare for boarding, all hands. We are not here for a simple scan. We're going to find out what happened to the Leviathan." The fleet's ships positioned themselves around the warship, creating a secure perimeter while the boarding teams suited up and prepared to disembark. The team would consist of engineers, medical officers, security personnel, and, of course, the Council's top investigators. There was no telling what they would find inside the Leviathan. After all these years, the ship's crew could be anything or anyone, alive or dead, changed in ways beyond recognition. The first boarding party descended onto the Leviathan via shuttle, their boots clanking against the cold steel of the warship's airlock as they made their way inside. The eerie silence of the ship was palpable. It was as though it had been frozen in time, every room pristine, every control panel untouched. Yet there were no signs of life, no sounds, no movement. The team split up, each unit assigned to a different section of the warship. They explored the crew quarters, the control room, the engine bay. Every corner of the Leviathan was scoured, but nothing seemed out of place. No sign of a struggle, no indication of what had happened to the crew. It was as if the ship had simply stopped. But it wasn't until they reached the captain's quarters that things took a darker turn. The room was immaculately clean, but there, standing in the center of the room, was Captain Janus. He was not alone. A dozen crew members, all in the same state, standing still, unblinking, their expressions blank, were frozen in place. They had not aged, not even a day. Their uniforms were immaculate, their faces the same as the last time anyone had seen them. But their eyes were hollow, their bodies unmoving as if trapped in some deep, unnatural sleep. Malthar's heart skipped a beat as he realized what he was looking at. These weren't survivors, they were something else. Something had happened to them, something that twisted their very existence. And somewhere, deep within the cold, silent ship, the truth waited to be uncovered. But it was clear that the Leviathan was far more than a simple warship. It was the key to a mystery that the galaxy was not yet ready to understand. The silence in the captain's quarters was suffocating as Admiral Malthar stood frozen in place, staring at the motionless crew members. The flickering lights overhead cast eerie shadows across their faces, yet not one of them stirred, their eyes wide open and empty. The Admiral took a cautious step forward, his boots making a soft echo against the polished floor. Behind him, the other members of the boarding party lingered, their own disbelief palpable as they examined the uncanny stillness of the crew. "Status report." Malthar's voice broke the silence, more a command than a question. His team was quick to respond, their voices tinged with uncertainty. "Everything appears normal on the surface, sir. No signs of physical trauma or biological decay. They're just frozen, like they're not even breathing." Malthar nodded slowly, trying to process the situation. The crew wasn't dead. They weren't even sick. But they weren't alive either, at least not in the way that should be possible. He turned to the medical officer, Dr. Valara, whose hand hovered over a datapad as she scanned the crew for any life signs. "They're alive," she said, voice barely above a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe her own words. "But their vitals are unusual, slower than anything I've ever encountered. Their bodies are essentially in stasis, like they're suspended in time." Suspended in time. The words echoed in Malthar's mind, but they didn't make sense. How could a living being be frozen in such a state? And why hadn't the rest of the galaxy discovered the ship sooner if this anomaly had been lingering all this time? The answers seemed just out of reach, a riddle too complex to solve with mere technology. Malthar's attention was drawn back to Captain Janus, still standing at the center of the room, his figure seemingly untouched by time. The captain's face was as stern and unmoving as ever, but there was something unsettling about his expression, something that hinted at a deep knowledge, a burden that no one on this ship could begin to understand. The Admiral took a step forward, breaking the eerie stillness of the room. "Captain Janus," he called, his voice strong but betraying the uncertainty that he felt. "Captain, can you hear me?" There was no response, not even the slightest flicker of movement from the man. Malphar glanced at the medical officer. "Can you wake him up? Get him to respond." Dr. Valara looked hesitant, but she nodded and moved closer to the captain. She placed a hand on Janus' shoulder, as if testing the waters. When there was no immediate reaction, she ran a diagnostic scan on him, her device humming softly. The readings were baffling. Janus' body appeared perfectly healthy, but his mind, his neural patterns were something else entirely. There was a strange, almost imperceptible signal emanating from his brainwaves, something that suggested he was still aware but locked in a state of deep paralysis. "I don't think we can wake him, sir," Valara said, shaking her head. "Whatever's happened to them, it's beyond anything we're equipped to handle." Malphar stared at Janus for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. The captain had been an experienced leader, a tactical genius during the wars against the rival empires. But this was beyond even his understanding. "Then we need to get answers. Start with the ship's logs. Everything you can find. We need to know what happened here." The team scattered to their assigned tasks, combing through the warship systems. The data logs were more complex than anything they had expected, encrypted and corrupted beyond recognition, as if someone, or something, had deliberately erased key sections. It took hours, but finally, a breakthrough came. One of the tech specialists found a hidden compartment deep within the warship's central core. It wasn't in any of the standard system logs. It was buried, a rogue section of the ship's eye. Malphar's heart raced as the technician unearthed the fragmented file. What they discovered was far more unsettling than anything they could have imagined. The files revealed that the Leviathan had been caught in a gravitational anomaly during its last mission, a rift in space that had opened up unexpectedly, pulling the warship into an unknown dimension. But the true horror lay in the experiments that had been conducted afterward. The crew had been subjected to an ancient alien technology, something that had altered their very biology, slowing their aging and twisting their perception of time. And most terrifying of all was the mention of a guardian, a being that had seemingly trapped them there. Malphar felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he read the last line of the log, a message left by Captain Janus himself, almost as if warning anyone who found the ship, "Do not try to bring us back, or you will regret it." The message echoed in Malphar's mind as he stared at the final line of the captain's log. "Do not try to bring us back, or you will regret it." The words seemed to linger in the air, thick with meaning, but what exactly was Captain Janus warning them about? The Admiral felt the weight of those words pressing on him, a sense of foreboding creeping into his thoughts. His fingers tightened around the datapad, and he turned to Dr. Valara, who had been reading over the logs with him. She looked up, her face pale, her brow furrowed with confusion and concern. "Do you think this guardian could still be here?" Malphar asked, his voice low, but sharp. Valara didn't answer immediately. She ran her fingers through her hair, visibly unsettled by the implications. "I don't know, sir, but something about this feels wrong. If these logs are accurate, this dimension they were trapped in, this rift, it wasn't just some accident. It sounds like the crew was drawn in intentionally, as if they were part of an experiment or worse, some kind of sacrifice." Malphar looked back at Captain Janus, still frozen in place, his blank eyes staring into nothingness. The crew had been trapped for decades, their bodies seemingly frozen in time while their minds were altered beyond recognition. Was this the work of an alien entity? Or something far worse, something the Council was not ready to face? As the crew worked to analyze the logs further, the air on the Leviathan grew heavier, more oppressive. It was as though the ship itself was watching them, waiting for something. The hum of the warship's engines, once a comforting sound, now seemed foreboding, its deep vibrations resonating through the walls. Malphar knew something was wrong. something he couldn't quite put into words, but the longer they stayed on this ship, the more he felt it. Every creak of the metal, every flicker of the lights, it all seemed to whisper a warning. The team continued their investigation, but as they ventured deeper into the ship, it became clear that the warship had changed. The corridors, once so familiar to its crew, now felt unfamiliar and alien. The walls had a strange, almost organic quality to them, as if they were alive, pulsating with some unseen energy. The crew members still stood motionless, but there was an eerie sense that they were not entirely absent, that something, or someone, was pulling the strings, controlling them from within. It was the communications officer who first noticed it. One of the consoles began to blink erratically, its screen flickering in a way that suggested something was trying to force its way through. The officer tried to access the system, but the interface was corrupted, the data flowing like a chaotic river of symbols and images. And then, a voice. Not from the comms, but from somewhere deeper in the ship. It was low, guttural, and alien. The voice didn't come through the usual channels. It was as if it was coming from the very walls of the ship itself. The crew froze, their eyes scanning the room, trying to locate the source, but no one could pinpoint it. The voice spoke again, unintelligible words that seemed to crawl under their skin, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Malfar's heart raced. He wasn't sure what they were dealing with, but whatever it was far beyond their understanding. "Admiral, we need to get out of here," Dr. Valera said, her voice trembling as she joined him. "Whatever this is, it's not human. The rift, the Guardian, it's all connected. We've triggered something by coming here." Malfar turned to face her, his eyes narrowed in resolve. "We can't leave. Not yet. There's too much at stake. We need to understand what happened, or we won't be able to stop it from happening again." But even as he spoke, he felt the pull of something dark, something ancient, lingering in the ship. The warning from Captain Janus echoed once more in his mind. "Do not try to bring us back, or you will regret it." They had already crossed a line, and now, it seemed, there was no turning back. Whatever had ensnared the crew of the Leviathan was still here, waiting, and it had no intention of letting them leave so easily. A chill ran through Malfar as the lights above flickered once more, and for a brief moment he could have sworn he saw movement in the shadows. Was it the crew? Or something else, something far more sinister? The walls of the Leviathan seemed to close in around him, and he realized with a sinking feeling that they might have already been caught in something far worse than they could have ever imagined. The air in the Leviathan had become thick with an unnatural tension, as though the very walls were alive, pulsating with a dark energy. Malthar stood in the dimly lit corridor, the voice he had heard earlier still echoing in his mind. It was like a low hum, barely perceptible yet all-consuming, weaving its way through the very structure of the ship. His every instinct screamed to leave, to retreat back to the fleet and report that this was beyond them, beyond any technology they understood. But there was no turning back now. They had uncovered something monumental, something that could change the balance of the galaxy forever. The crew members, still frozen in place, seemed to shift ever so slightly with the passing moments. Their stillness no longer seemed benign. It felt as though they were biding their time, waiting for something. The hum in the walls grew louder, reverberating through Malfar's chest, making his heart beat in rhythm with the alien presence that had taken root in the Leviathan. He turned to Dr. Valera, whose face was ashen as she examined the medical records and scans of the crew. Her fingers trembled as she ran another diagnostic scan on Captain Janus, but the results were no less puzzling. "Admiral, his neural patterns, they're not human anymore. There's something inside his mind, something that wasn't there before." Malthar swallowed hard, his gaze locked on the captain, who stood in eerie stillness in the center of the room. Janus' eyes were empty, his expression locked in a state of perpetual calm, but there was something profoundly unsettling about his presence. It was as though he was more than just a man. He was a conduit, a vessel for something far older, far more powerful. And if the captain was a vessel, then what was he carrying? And why had he been chosen? Whatever's in his mind, it's not just affecting him. Valera continued, her voice barely audible. It's affecting the entire crew. They're not just trapped in stasis. They're being controlled, their minds, warped into something else. Malthar felt the weight of her words settle over him. The crew had been altered. And it was clear now that this was not a simple case of being trapped in an alternate dimension. This was something much darker. The alien technology that had infiltrated the Leviathan wasn't just manipulating their bodies. It was reshaping their very thoughts, their consciousness, bending them to its will. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the deck beneath them. The walls around them seemed to close in, and for a brief moment, Malthar thought he saw something move in the shadows. But when he looked again, nothing was there. "What is that?" one of the engineers asked, his voice trembling as he pointed toward the ceiling. The ship's lights flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to dance on their own. The temperature in the room plummeted, a chill creeping down Malthar's spine. Then, without warning, the captain's voice rang out, a deep, resonant tone that sent a shiver through everyone present. "You should not have come here," Janus intoned, his voice distant yet clear, as if speaking from both inside and outside the room at once. It was not the voice Malthar remembered from before. This voice was laced with an otherworldly power, one that sent waves of dread coursing through his veins. "We were not meant to return," Janus continued, his lips not quite moving in sync with the words that flowed from his mouth. "The Guardian, it has claimed us. And now, it will claim you." A jolt of realization struck Malthar. The Guardian. That was what had kept the Leviathan trapped for all these years, what had warped its crew into something other. It was not just a force of nature. It was a being, an entity with a will of its own, one that had laid claim to the Warship and its crew. And now it was turning its attention toward them. The walls around them seemed to pulse again, the shadows growing thicker, darker until they seemed to take form, like sentient tendrils creeping toward the group. Malthar's pulse quickened as the air grew colder, his breath visible in the sudden frost that began to form on the walls. "We must leave," Valera said, her voice laced with panic. "Whatever this Guardian is, it's not something we can fight. We need to get out. Now." But Malthar stood frozen, his mind racing. The message from Captain Janus, the warning, it all made sense now. They had triggered something by boarding the ship, something ancient and beyond their control. The galaxy would not survive if they left the Leviathan in the hands of whatever this entity was. Malthar made his decision. He turned to his team. "We can't leave. Not yet. We need to find a way to stop this thing. If it gets out, if it escapes, there will be no stopping it." He looked back at Janus, whose eyes were now glowing faintly, his body seemingly trembling with barely contained power. The captain was no longer just a man. He was the vessel of something far more terrifying. And now, it seemed, the galaxy's fate rested in their hands. The tension on the Leviathan was suffocating, the air thick with the presence of something far beyond their understanding. Malthar's mind raced as he glanced from the frozen crew to Captain Janus, whose body now seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy. The faint glow in Janus' eyes flickered, not with life, but with something more primal, more ancient. The being inside the captain was awakening, and it was clear that the ship, this warship that had been lost for so long, was the key to everything. "Admiral, we need to get to the bridge," Dr. Valera said urgently, her eyes wide with fear. "If the Guardian is here, if it's really controlling Janus, it must be tied to the central systems. We have to shut down whatever is fueling this." Malthar nodded, a tight expression on his face. The crew was trapped, manipulated by an unseen force, and the very ship they stood in was alive in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. If they were going to stop this entity, they had to act fast before it completely overtook them. "We move out," Malphar ordered, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "Get to the bridge. Now." The team moved quickly, navigating the eerie corridors of the Leviathan, the pulsating walls seeming to close in as they passed. Each step felt like an eternity, the shadows clinging to them, watching their every move. The lights flickered again, casting them in brief flashes of stark white and unsettling darkness. The hum in the walls was louder now, almost deafening, and the air seemed to grow colder with every passing second. As they reached the bridge, the doors slid open with an eerie hiss, revealing a room that felt impossibly vast. The massive control panels stood untouched, the view screens showing nothing but static and distortion. The captain's chair sat in the center, empty, but a sense of foreboding filled the space. Something was watching them. "I don't like this," one of the engineers muttered, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. "Stay focused," Malphar said sharply, motioning to the central console. "Get those systems online. We need to find the source of the disturbance." As the engineers worked to bring the systems online, Malphar felt a cold shiver race up his spine. The hum in the walls was louder now, but it wasn't just coming from the ship. It was coming from within him, from his own thoughts. The presence, the entity that had taken control of the crew, was making its move. Suddenly, the bridge lights dimmed, and a deep voice rumbled through the room. It wasn't Janus speaking, but something much older, much darker. It echoed through the ship's intercom system, reverberating in the walls, in the very air they breathed. "You should not have come," the voice boomed, every word dripping with malice. "You are trespassers. The Leviathan is mine, and so are you." The words sent a shockwave of fear through Malphar's body. He could feel it, that weight in the air, the oppressive presence pushing against him. The walls of the bridge seemed to pulse, the shadows moving of their own accord, twisting into forms that almost seemed alive. The cold deepened, and Malphar could feel his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Admiral," Valara said urgently, her voice cracking. "The system's locked down. Whatever this entity is, it's in full control of the ship. We can't override it. We're trapped." Malphar turned toward her, his mind racing. The Guardian had complete control. They had thought they were boarding a warship to uncover a lost crew, but they had found something far worse. The Leviathan was more than just a ship. It was a prison, and the Guardian within had enslaved the crew to its will. "We need to find the source," Malphar said, his mind working quickly. "There must be a central core, a heart to this ship. If we can destroy it, we might be able to sever its hold on the crew, and on this ship." But as he spoke, a cold voice filled the room again, one that seemed to echo in every corner, in his very mind. "You cannot escape," the voice said. "The Leviathan is bound to me. And now, so are you." The ship groaned, as if in response, and Malphar felt something shift in the air. The walls bent, distorting, and the shadows grew more tangible, creeping toward them. The Guardian's presence was suffocating, filling every inch of the room with a malevolent force. The floor beneath them trembled as if the very foundations of the Leviathan were shifting, like the ship itself was alive, writhing under the influence of the entity inside it. Malphar's pulse quickened. They were running out of time. Whatever this thing was, it was toying with them, testing their resolve. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when they were so close to uncovering the truth behind this ship and its terrifying power. "Move out," Malphar commanded, his voice cutting through the growing chaos. "We're going to find that core, and we're going to destroy it, no matter what it takes." But as they moved forward, the walls groaned again, and the shadows closed in, this time with a violent force, as if the ship itself had made its decision. It wasn't just a warship anymore. It was a predator, and they were its prey. The air on the Leviathan felt as if it was alive, suffocating them with every breath. The hum that had once been a distant background noise now vibrated deep within their bones, an oppressive force that seemed to grow louder and more intense with each passing moment. Malthar felt his pulse quicken, his thoughts scattering as the oppressive presence of the Guardian seemed to seep into his very mind. It was everywhere, inside the walls, inside the ship, inside him. They were no longer just aboard a warship. They were trapped inside a living nightmare, one that seemed to mock every attempt they made to escape. "Admiral," Valara whispered, her voice trembling, "we can't keep going like this. The ship is alive. We're inside it, and it's controlling everything. If we don't find a way to stop this, we're all going to become part of it." Malthar didn't reply immediately, his mind working through the information, the scattered fragments of the logs, the warnings from Captain Janus. The Guardian, whatever it was, had taken control of the ship long ago, and now it was using the vessel as a weapon, as a prison. It was no longer just a ship. It was a vessel of pure power, a conduit for something ancient and horrifying. "We have to find the core," Malthar said, his voice grim with resolve. "The central heart of this ship. That's the key to stopping this." The team moved cautiously through the corridors, every step they took now a calculated risk. The shadows in the hallways seemed to grow longer, more distorted, as though the walls themselves were breathing, shifting with the pulse of the ship. The temperature had dropped further, and the oppressive cold wrapped around them like a vice. The crew remained frozen, their blank eyes staring at nothing, their bodies locked in unnatural stillness. The presence of the Guardian was undeniable. It had taken them, reshaped them, and now it was playing with them, treating them like nothing more than insects in a web. They reached the central chamber, the heart of the ship, but as the doors slid open, the room that greeted them was unlike anything they had expected. The walls were alive, undulating, covered in strange, glowing symbols that pulsed with an unearthly energy. At the center of the room stood a massive structure, a column of swirling darkness, surrounded by alien tendrils that seemed to pulse in time with the heartbeat of the ship. It was as though the entire core of the Leviathan was alive, breathing in sync with the entity that controlled it. A deep voice, that same guttural sound that had echoed through the ship, reverberated through the room. "You are fools," it said, its tone dripping with disdain. "You think you can destroy me. I am the Leviathan. I am its soul, its mind, its power. You cannot stop what has already begun." Malthar's grip tightened on his weapon, but he felt the futility of his movements. The Guardian, whatever it was beyond their reach. It had infiltrated the very core of the ship, bending it to its will. This wasn't just a force of nature. This was something with a purpose, with intelligence, and it wasn't going to let them leave. Dr. Valara stepped forward, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to sever the connection between the ship and this entity. If we can cut it off from its power source, maybe we can weaken it. Maybe we can kill it." Malthar nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the swirling mass at the center of the room. The core, the source of the ship's dark power. It was pulsing with an otherworldly energy, and he could feel its presence pushing against him, trying to worm its way into his mind, to take hold of him as it had taken hold of Janus and the crew. "How do we destroy it?" Malthar asked, his voice low and filled with doubt. The more he looked at the core, the more he felt the weight of the decision settling on him. Could they really destroy it? Could they sever the connection to the ship without destroying everything in the process? Valara didn't answer immediately, her eyes scanning the alien architecture of the room. "I think there's a reactor at the base of the core," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "If we can overload it, force a shutdown, it could collapse the entire system. But we'll need to get close, and we'll need to disrupt the Guardian's influence long enough to make it happen." A sense of urgency gripped Malthar as he realized the truth. They were out of time. The longer they stood here, the stronger the Guardian's hold would become, and the harder it would be to fight back. They had to act fast. "All right," he said, his voice steady. We'll make our move. We take out the core. Now." With that, the team rushed toward the base of the core, navigating the alien tendrils that reached out like grasping hands, as if trying to stop them. The presence of the Guardian pressed in around them, its voice rumbling in their minds. "You cannot stop me," it said, its tone filled with malice. "I am eternal. I am the Leviathan, and I will never let you go." Malthar's resolve hardened as they reached the reactor. It was time to end this. The air in the chamber was thick with the energy of the core, the swirling mass of darkness at the center of the Leviathan pulsing like a living heart. Malthar could feel it, the suffocating weight of the entity's power pressing against him, trying to worm its way into his mind. The shadows stretched and twisted, the alien tendrils reaching out like skeletal hands, rushing against his skin with a cold that made his bones ache. But he pushed the fear down. He couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. The lives of his crew, the fate of the galaxy, everything depended on the success of this mission. They had to destroy the core before the Guardian's influence could spread any further. And they had to do it quickly, before the ship fully reclaimed them all. Dr. Valera stood beside him, her face pale but resolute as she worked at a console near the base of the core. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift in response to her presence, the room alive with an unnatural hum. Every flicker of the lights, every surge of energy in the ship seemed to make the walls vibrate in time with the heartbeat of the Guardian. "We don't have much time," Valera said, her voice tight. "The Guardian is aware of us now. It's adapting, adjusting its defenses. The reactor could go critical if we don't overload it in the next few minutes." Malthar glanced at her, the weight of the situation clear in his eyes. He knew they had to act fast, or all would be lost. The presence of the Guardian was becoming unbearable, its voice a constant, oppressive pressure in his mind, telling him to give up, to submit. But Malthar's resolve only grew stronger. "Admiral," one of the engineers called out from the other side of the room, his voice strained as he worked at another console. "The reactor's energy levels are rising rapidly. We're getting close, but we'll need to initiate a manual shutdown sequence to trigger the overload. The Guardian will try to stop us. We have to be ready for that." A cold laugh filled the air, dark and mocking, as if the ship itself was mocking their efforts. "You think you can destroy me? I am the Leviathan." The voice of the Guardian rumbled. "I am eternal. Your pitiful attempts will not save you. You cannot kill me." Malthar's jaw clenched, and he took a step forward, his weapon raised. "We'll see about that." The walls seemed to pulse with an even greater intensity, and Malthar could feel the very ground beneath him tremble. The temperature plummeted further, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. It was as if the ship itself was trying to crush them, to make them submit to its will. But Malthar and his team pressed on, working in tandem to initiate the shutdown sequence. Every movement felt like it was against the clock, as the power of the Guardian swelled around them, pushing against their minds, trying to break their resolve. Malthar could feel his thoughts being clouded, the whispers of the Guardian pressing against his consciousness, telling him to stop, to surrender, to join it. "Focus." Valera's voice cut through the haze in his mind. "We're almost there. Just a little longer." The lights flickered violently, and the ship groaned, its walls shifting, its core's energy pulsing like a living, breathing thing. The tendrils began to lash out, striking the walls around them, sending sparks flying. The Guardian's voice grew louder, its presence more overwhelming, as if it were tearing at the very fabric of the ship in its desperation to stop them. Malthar pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the final sequence of the shutdown was initiated. The core trembled, and the room seemed to shift around them as the ship fought to hold onto its control. But it was too late. The overload had been triggered. There was a deafening roar as the core erupted in a burst of dark energy, the tendrils thrashing wildly as the very heart of the ship began to collapse in on itself. The walls cracked, the ship groaning under the strain, and the Guardian's voice screamed in fury. its presence fracturing as the connection to the core began to break. Malthar didn't hesitate. With one final push, the team sprinted toward the exit as the room around them began to implode. The ship was falling apart, its structure collapsing as the core's power became too much to contain. They ran through the corridors, the walls buckling, the air thick with the echoes of the Guardian's fading voice. "You cannot escape," the voice rasped, but it was weaker now, fading as the core's power shattered. The team reached the escape pod bay, and with one final, desperate effort, they launched themselves out of the Leviathan. The warship's massive form shuddered as it began to break apart, the last vestiges of the Guardian's influence vanishing into the cold vacuum of space. As they drifted away from the wreckage, Malthar looked out at the destruction, a heavy silence settling over them. The Leviathan was no more, and the Guardian, whatever it was, had been destroyed. But the price had been high. They had barely escaped with their lives, and the galaxy would never know the full horror of what had been lurking within that warship. But Malthar knew one thing for certain: the shadows they had faced on the Leviathan would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And even now, as they drifted toward safety, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next opening. And next time, it would be ready.